December 7, 1941. The morning air over Oahu is heavy, not yet with the heat of the tropical sun, but with the scent of sea salt and the rhythmic, peaceful lap of tide against steel. At 7:48, that peace is torn asunder. The sky screams as 353 Japanese aircraft descend like a mechanical plague. In the span of 90 minutes, the Pacific Fleet, the supposed backbone of American reach, is transformed into a graveyard of burning oil and twisted metal. As the last Zero climbs back into the clouds, the Japanese pilots look down upon a blackened horizon. They see the Arizona shattered, the Oklahoma capsized like a dead leviathan, and the West Virginia sinking into the mud. In their minds, the war in the Pacific is over before it has truly begun. They believe they have not just wounded a fleet, but decapitated a nation's ability to resist. To the Imperial Japanese Navy, Pearl Harbor is no longer a base, it is a tomb. But beneath the surface of the oily, blood-stained water, the reality is far more complex than the victory reports sent back to Tokyo. The Japanese High Command operated on a philosophy of Kantai-kei, or the decisive battle. They believed that by destroying the enemy's capital ships in one swift, overwhelming stroke, the American spirit would fracture, and the industrial giant would sue for peace. They saw ships as the final word in naval power. What they failed to account for was the American philosophy of resilience, a belief that nothing is ever truly broken beyond repair if you have the tools, the will, and an almost supernatural abundance of resources. While Japan celebrated a masterstroke of tactical genius, the United States was already beginning a feat of engineering that defied the known laws of naval logistics. The contrast between expectation and reality began the moment the fires were extinguished. The Japanese sailors had been told the Americans were soft, a decadent people preoccupied with luxury and incapable of the grim stoicism required for a long war. They expected the U.S. Navy to retreat to the West Coast, abandoning the wreckage of Hawaii. Instead, they met the American salvage teams. These were men who didn't look like warriors, they were divers, welders, and engineers. They waded into water thick with congealed oil and human remains, equipped with a symbolic tool that would come to haunt the Japanese logistical nightmare, the arc welder's spark. To the Japanese, a sunken ship was a memory. To the Americans, a sunken ship was merely a project that hadn't been finished yet. The scale of the impossible task cannot be overstated. Of the 96 vessels present that morning, 19 were sunk or severely damaged. The pride of the fleet, the battleships of Battleship Row, were the primary focus. The Nevada had been run aground to prevent her from sinking in the channel. The California and West Virginia sat upright but submerged in the silt. The Maryland and Tennessee were pinned against the keys by the wreckage of their sisters. To any traditional naval strategist in 1941, the recovery of these vessels was a decade-long prospect. Japan's intelligence suggested that even if the Americans tried to salvage them, the effort would drain their resources so thoroughly that they would be unable to build new ships. They underestimated the industrial ghost that was waking up in the shipyards of the mainland and the sheer, relentless abundance of the American supply chain. As the salvage operations began in earnest in early 1942, the symbolic presence of American abundance began to manifest in the most mundane of places, the mess halls and the supply crates. While Japanese sailors were often rationed to meager portions of rice and pickled vegetables, the American salvage crews were fueled by a logistical machine that treated luxury as a standard operating procedure. A recurring symbol of this contrast was the standard issue crate of oranges. To a Japanese soldier or sailor, fresh fruit in the middle of a war zone was a rare gift from the emperor himself. To the American diver emerging from the suffocating darkness of a flooded hull, it was a snack. This abundance wasn't just about food, it reflected a democratic ideology that prioritized the well-being and the tools of the individual worker. If a diver needed a specific pneumatic pump, 3 were sent. If a welder needed a specialized alloy, it arrived by the ton. This was the arsenal of democracy, in its most granular, grimy form. The technical records of the Pearl Harbor Navy yard tell a story of frantic, brilliant improvisation. The salvage of the USS Oklahoma remains one of the greatest engineering feats in history. The ship had rolled completely over, her masts driven into the mud of the harbor floor. The Japanese assumed she was a total loss, a permanent monument to their victory. However, the Americans refused to accept the verdict of the sea. They constructed massive timber righting frames and used 21 electric winches to slowly, inch by inch, pull the 30,000-ton behemoth back to an even keel. This wasn't just a repair, it was a resurrection. Every time a winch turned, it signaled a shift in the psychological landscape of the war. The Japanese thought they had buried the US Navy, they didn't realize they had only planted it. The emotional toll on the salvage crews was immense, yet it was catalyzed into a cold, efficient fury. Divers had to enter the doomed ships to recover bodies and seal compartments. In the silence of the sunken Arizona, they found pockets of air where men had survived for days, marking their final hours on calendars. This trauma did not break the Americans, it hardened their resolve. The perception of the Japanese shifted from a formidable foe to a debt to be collected. Every patch of steel welded onto a hull was a payment on that debt. The ideology of the American worker, the belief that any problem could be solved with enough steel, enough sweat, and enough electricity, began to overshadow the Japanese ideology of Yamato Damashii, or the spiritual indomitability of the warrior. Spiritualism, the Americans proved, was no match for a 1,000-ton hydraulic pump. By mid-1942, the miracle was becoming a terrifying reality for the Japanese High Command. Reports began to trickle in of ships that had been confirmed sunk appearing in combat zones. When the USS Yorktown was damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea, Japanese observers estimated it would take 6 months to repair in a state-of-the-art shipyard. The Americans pulled it into Pearl Harbor, swarmed it with 1,400 repairmen, and sent it back out in 72 hours to fight at Midway. This was the moment the Japanese perception of the war began to rot. They realized they weren't fighting a navy, they were fighting a factory that could swim. The abundance of the American system, symbolized by their unending supply of fresh oranges and the constant hum of the welding torch, represented a level of freedom that the Japanese military structure couldn't comprehend. In a democracy, the industrialist and the soldier were two sides of the same coin, both invested in the survival of a system that provided them with the highest standard of living in the world. The transformation of Pearl Harbor from a site of disaster to the world's most efficient repair hub changed the very DNA of the US military. It taught the Americans that logistics was the supreme art of war. While Japan focused on the decisive blow, the United States focused on the infinite return. This shift in perception was most evident in the eyes of the young American sailors who saw the USS West Virginia, a ship they had seen resting on the bottom of the harbor, steaming back into the fray with modernized radar and bristling anti-aircraft batteries. It was no longer the ship that had been defeated in 1941, it was a vengeful ghost, rebuilt by the hands of a nation that refused to acknowledge the possibility of permanent loss. As the sun sets over the harbor in these early months of the recovery, the flickering light of the welding torches creates a second constellation on the surface of the water. Each spark is a testament to an ideology of abundance. The Japanese sought to bring a new order to the Pacific through destruction, but they were being met by an old order of liberty that found its greatest strength in restoration. The sea, once a barrier and a grave, was becoming a highway for American steel. The Japanese had struck the anvil, but they hadn't realized that the anvil was made of 1,000,000 determined men and an inexhaustible supply of resources. The war was no longer about who had the best pilots or the fastest ships, it was about who could sustain the most life and rebuild the fastest from the ashes. The silence of the Pacific was now broken not by the sound of falling bombs, but by the rhythmic, industrial heartbeat of Pearl Harbor. It was a sound of defiance. It was the sound of a nation that viewed every setback as a setup for a comeback. The destroyed fleet was breathing again, its lungs filled with compressed air and its veins flowing with heavy oil. The Japanese had aimed for the heart of the American dragon, but they had only succeeded in waking it up and giving it a reason to grow a second hate. The repair of the fleet wasn't just a military necessity, it was a moral imperative that proved, once and for all, that the American spirit was as durable as the steel it forged. By the summer of 1942, the smoke that had once billowed from the funeral pyres of Battleship Row had been replaced by a different kind of haze, the thick, industrial smog of 24-hour production. At the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, the concept of a workday had vanished, replaced by a relentless three-shift rotation that saw the harbor illuminated under massive floodlights every night. To an outside observer, it looked like a city of fire rising from the sea. This was the era of the Great Resurrection, where the technical impossibility of salvaging the Pacific Fleet met the sheer, unadulterated force of American logistical abundance. The Japanese intelligence services, monitoring from afar, remained trapped in a state of disbelief. Their naval doctrine dictated that a battleship submerged in salt water for 6 months was a write-off, a hunk of corroding iron fit only for the breakers. They did not account for the American pneumatic drill, a tool that became a rhythmic anthem of the recovery, echoing across the water like a heartbeat that refused to stop. The historical context of this period was defined by a desperate race against time. While the salvage teams labored in Hawaii, the Japanese Empire was expanding at a terrifying velocity, swallowing the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. The barrier that Pearl Harbor was supposed to provide had been breached, and the American public was gripped by the fear of a West Coast invasion. Every ship returned to the line was not just a tactical asset, it was a psychological shield. The US Navy knew that for every day a ship sat in the mud, the Japanese moved a mile closer to Midway and beyond. The pressure on the salvage crews was suffocating, yet it was here that the emotional contrast between the two warring ideologies became most stark. The Japanese soldier was taught that his life was lighter than a feather compared to the emperor's will. The American worker was taught that his ingenuity was the very engine of freedom. This ideology of the individual was manifested in the patch and pump operations. The USS California, which had settled into the thick mud of the harbor floor after being hit by 2 torpedoes and 2 bombs, presented a nightmare of naval architecture. To raise her, the Americans didn't just use brute force, they used a sophisticated system of cofferdams, wooden and steel enclosures built around the jagged holes in her hull. The sheer volume of lumber and steel required for these temporary patches was more than the Japanese merchant marine could often allocate for an entire month of shipbuilding. This was the symbolic weight of American democracy, the ability to waste massive amounts of high-quality material on a temporary fix just to get a ship to a dry dock. To the Japanese, who were already feeling the pinch of resource scarcity, such a display of abundance was incomprehensible. It was the standard issue crate of oranges again, a bounty so common it was treated as a baseline, proving that the American system was not struggling to survive, but was thriving in its output. The factual records of the California's recovery read like a triumph of human endurance over chemistry. The interior of the ship was a toxic wasteland. The stagnant water had mixed with thousands of gallons of fuel oil and decomposing rations, creating a lethal, black mayonnaise that coated every surface. Gases like hydrogen sulfide turned the ship into a potential bomb. Divers worked in total darkness, navigating by touch through a labyrinth of submerged corridors filled with jagged steel and the remains of their comrades. Documented quotes from the salvage crews reveal a grim, dark humor. One diver remarked that the smell of the California could knock a buzzard off a gut wagon, yet they went back down, hour after hour. They were driven by a transformation of identity. They were no longer just repairmen, they were the ghost makers, bringing the dead back to haunt those who had killed them. The Japanese perception of these ships was rooted in the ancient idea of the warrior's soul. To them, a ship that had been sunk had lost its spirit, it was a shamed entity. When the USS West Virginia, a ship the Japanese were certain had been pulverized, was finally pumped dry and floated in June 1942, it revealed a haunting sight. In one compartment, the salvage crew found a calendar with 28 days crossed off. 3 sailors had survived in an air pocket for nearly a month, waiting for a rescue that couldn't reach them in time. The discovery of such tragedy could have broken a lesser workforce, but for the Americans, it served as a grim baptism. The WV, as she was known, became a vessel of vengeance. The ideology of the American crew shifted from defensive repair to aggressive reconstruction. They didn't just want the ship to float, they wanted it to be better, faster, and more lethal than it had been on December 6. This transformation was facilitated by the American mastery of the modular upgrade. Because of the abundance of parts and the standardized nature of American manufacturing, the salvage teams began to modernize the ships as they fixed them. They stripped away the old cage masts and replaced them with streamlined bridges and the latest radar arrays. They added dozens of Bofors and Oerlikon anti-aircraft guns. The ships were being reborn in a literal sense, evolving from World War I-era relics into modern killing machines. This was a concept the Japanese, with their artisanal and often non-standardized shape construction, struggled to match. While a Japanese ship repair might take months due to a lack of specific, hand-fitted parts, the Americans were cannibalizing the destroyed Arizona and Oklahoma to feed the recovery of the others, backed by a supply line that stretched 2,000 miles back to the mainland. As the California and West Virginia were towed into the dry docks, the symbolic arc welder's spark flew in a continuous rain of white-hot light. The sound of the yard was a cacophony of progress, the hiss of acetylene torches, the clang of sledgehammers, and the constant, reassuring drone of the air compressors. To the sailors who had survived the attack, seeing these ships rise was like watching a resurrection in slow motion. The emotional reflection of this moment was profound. They realized that the Japanese had destroyed the flesh of the fleet, but they hadn't touched the bone. The bone was the industrial capacity of the United States and the democratic belief that no man, and no ship, was truly lost until the last effort had been exhausted. By the late months of 1942, the first of the sunken battleships were ready to leave Hawaii for full modernization on the west coast. As the USS Nevada steamed out of the channel under her own power, her band played Way Back Home. It was a moment of poetic defiance. The ship that had been a burning wreck aground at Hospital Point was now a sleek, grey predator once more. The Japanese, who were now embroiled in the meat grinder of Guadalcanal, began to see the shadows of these ships on the horizon. They couldn't understand how the corpses of Pearl Harbor were suddenly appearing in the Solomons. The ideology of the decisive battle was crumbling. The Japanese had won the battle of the morning, but they were losing the war of the afternoon. The symbolic standard issue crate of oranges remained on the decks of these departing ships, a sign of a nation that could provide its sailors with the best food, the best medicine, and the best steel even while fighting a global war. This abundance was the ultimate weapon. It allowed the Americans to endure the unendurable, a phrase the Japanese emperor would later use in his surrender, not through suicidal spirit, but through industrial grace. The salvage of Pearl Harbor was proving that freedom wasn't just an abstract concept, it was a tangible, mechanical force that could pull 30,000 tons of steel from the bottom of the ocean and send it back to settle the score. The epilogue of this phase of the war was written in the logs of the salvage masters. They noted that while the Japanese had focused on the destruction of symbols, the great battleships, they had ignored the lowly targets, the fuel tank farms and the repair shops. This was the fundamental error of an aristocratic military mindset. They didn't understand that in a democracy, the power is not in the crown, but in the shop floor. The true strength of the U.S. Navy wasn't the Arizona, it was the man with the wrench and the infinite crates of supplies backing him up. As the ships left Pearl Harbor, they left behind a harbor that was no longer a graveyard, but the most powerful forge in human history. October 1944. The Philippine Sea is a vast, slate-gray expanse, restless and brooding under a heavy tropical sky. On the bridge of the USS West Virginia, the air is thick with the scent of ozone and the low, constant hum of advanced electronics. To a casual observer, she is a vision of American naval might, but to the Japanese observers peering through binoculars from the distant horizon of the Surigao Strait, she is something far more terrifying. She is a ghost. According to Imperial records, this ship was dead. She had been gutted by 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs. She had burned for 30 hours until her steel glowed cherry-red and she settled into the Hawaiian silt. Yet here she sits, her silhouette transformed, her decks bristling with more anti-aircraft fire than the Japanese had thought possible to mount on a single hull. The WV was no longer a victim, she was a harbinger of the end. The historical context of this moment represents the pivot point of the Pacific War. By late 1944, the United States was no longer merely defending, it was an unstoppable juggernaut, crushing the Japanese perimeter through the sheer weight of its logistical tail. The salvage operation at Pearl Harbor had transitioned from a desperate rescue mission into a refined, assembly line process of resurrection. The Americans had realized that the ships they raised were not just replacements for lost tonnage, they were psychological weapons. Every time a sunken ship reappeared in a task force, it sent a tremor through the Japanese command. It broke the fundamental law of their universe, that death is final. To the Japanese, who valued the beautiful death of a warrior, the American refusal to let their ships stay dead felt like a form of industrial necromancy. The emotional contrast between the two sides had now reached a breaking point. Japanese sailors were increasingly operating on suicide ships, vessels with half-trained crews, meager rations of sawdust-filled bread, and barely enough fuel for a one-way trip. They were expected to die for a cause that was visibly failing. Meanwhile, the American sailors on the salvaged battleships lived in a world of startling plenty. A recurring symbol of this democratic abundance was the ice cream machine. In the middle of a scorched ocean, inside the hulls of ships that had once been underwater tombs, the Americans had installed massive freezers and machinery to produce thousands of gallons of cold, sweet luxury. To the Japanese, who saw hardship as a virtue, this was decadent. But to the American sailor, the ice cream was a symbol of home, a reminder that the nation they represented was so powerful, so wealthy, and so committed to its people that it could deliver a taste of a Kansas summer to the gates of Tokyo. Historical evidence from the salvage logs shows that by this stage, the miracle of Pearl Harbor had been codified into a science. The USS West Virginia and the USS California had been completely reconstructed. Their old, cluttered interiors were gutted and replaced with a system of systems. They were equipped with the Mark 8 fire control radar, a piece of technology so advanced it allowed them to see in the pitch black of a storm. This was the transformation of the American ideology. They had moved beyond the era of the brave captain and into the era of the technocratic warrior. The ships were no longer just platforms for guns, they were floating computers, backed by a supply chain that ensured every shell fired was replaced by 10 more waiting in the holds of an auxiliary ship. The Japanese perception of the war was now one of mounting horror. At the Battle of Surigao Strait, the Japanese Southern Force steamed into a trap set by the very ghost they had created in 1941. Leading the American line were the West Virginia, the California, the Tennessee, the Maryland, and the Pennsylvania, all survivors of Pearl Harbor. It was a poetic irony that history rarely allows. The Japanese Admiral Nishimura, leading his ships into the darkness, believed he was facing a modern fleet of new construction. He did not realize that the steel coming to meet him was the same steel his pilots had destroyed 3 years prior. When the West Virginia opened fire at a range of 22,000 yards, her radar-guided shell struck with a precision that was mathematically impossible by Japanese standards. The ghosts were not just back, they were superior in every measurable way. The symbolic arc welder's spark that had started in the mud of Oahu had now become the muzzle flash of 16-inch guns. This was the ultimate realization of the American transformation. The salvage teams had not just fixed the ships, they had infused them with the spirit of the American factory. Each salvo was a message from the welders, the divers, and the engineers who had worked in the oily darkness of the harbor. It was a message that said, "Your destruction was temporary, our resolve is permanent." The abundance of American ammunition meant that the salvaged battleships could fire until their barrels were hot enough to melt, never fearing a shortage. The Japanese, meanwhile, had to husband every shell, every drop of oil, and every human life, leading to a paralysis of command that the Americans exploited with clinical efficiency. As the Japanese ships were torn apart by the very vessels they thought they had sent to the bottom of the sea, the emotional reflection on the American side was one of grim satisfaction. There was no dialogue needed, the thunder of the guns said everything. The sailors knew that the West Virginia was firing for the men who had been trapped in her hull in December 1941. They were firing for the black mayonnaise the divers had waded through. They were firing for the standard issue crate of oranges and the ice cream machine, for a way of life that valued the comfort of the common man as much as the power of the state. This was the collision of two worlds, one that worshipped the past and the glory of death, and one that worshipped the future and the persistence of life. The ideology of freedom and abundance had created a loop that the Japanese could not close. The more the Japanese destroyed, the more the Americans built and repaired. The more the Japanese sacrificed, the more the Americans optimized. By the time the West Virginia ceased fire at Surigao Strait, the Japanese decisive battle doctrine was in tatters. They had sought one great victory to end the war, but they had found themselves in a war of attrition against an opponent who viewed attrition as merely a logistical challenge to be solved. The salvage of Pearl Harbor was the ultimate proof that the American system was not a fragile machine that could be broken by a single blow, but a self-healing organism that grew stronger with every wound. The symbolism of the pneumatic drill and the welding torch had now transitioned into the sound of the victory siren. As the salvaged ships turned back toward their bases for resupply, they did so with the knowledge that they were part of something larger than a navy. They were the physical manifestation of a nation's refusal to be defeated. The destroyed fleet was now the vanguard of the liberation of the Pacific. To the Japanese, the sight of these ships was a psychological death blow. It was the realization that they weren't fighting a war they could win, they were fighting a war. The historical context of this final day is one of absolute ideological victory. The war did not end because of a single weapon, but because of a systemic collapse of the Japanese ability to compete with American reality. The salvage teams at Pearl Harbor had done more than fix ships. They had set the pace for a new world order based on the American way of logistics. Throughout 1945, while Japan's cities were being reduced to ash and its people were reduced to eating sawdust and grass, the United States was maintaining a standard of living for its frontline soldiers that exceeded that of a pre-war Japanese aristocrat. This was the ultimate, decisive battle, the battle of the factory, the shipyard, and the supply line. The restoration of the Pearl Harbor fleet was the opening salvo of this industrial crusade, proving that in the modern age, the nation that can repair its mistakes fastest is the nation that inherits the future. The emotional contrast in these final hours is staggering. The Japanese delegates, dressed in formal morning coats or tattered military uniforms, move with a brittle, hollow dignity. They represent a culture that believed spirit could overcome steel, a belief that has left them starving and defeated. Conversely, The American sailors watching from the rails of the West Virginia and the California are the embodiment of a restless, productive energy. They are well-fed, equipped with the finest tools human ingenuity could devise, and backed by a home front that is already pivoting back to civilian prosperity. The recurring symbol of the standard issue crate of oranges has been replaced by the chocolate bar and the cigarette pack, luxury items produced by the billions and distributed with a casualness that signals an infinite reserve of wealth. To the Americans, abundance is a right; to the Japanese, it has become a myth. The historical evidence of this final transformation is found in the sheer statistics of the U.S. Navy in 1945. The fleet debt.